Hi and welcome to our nursing research course, wherein our first task is to talk about conceptualization. This is the first and most important part when conducting a research. This is a guide for mentors, but at the same time, it is useful for student researchers who will be developing their research projects for their nursing research course. With me are the other research coordinators, Ms. Lipura and Mrs. Carillo, who will be facilitating our research program from the first semester up until the second semester. For today, here are our objectives. First in our objectives is the conceptualization phase as a phase in research. As what I've mentioned, this is one and the most important phase that needs to be established when conducting a research. Second is guiding in idea generation and topic selection for research, refining the research question, understanding the variables of the study design and feasibility, and later on in a separate orientation, we will talk about ethics because ethics is important so that we can safeguard the welfare of our respondents and our researchers. When we say conceptualization, conceptualization is a phase in nursing research that covers several interconnected elements that lay the foundation for a rigorous and impactful study. What does this tell us? No? It lays a good foundation because without proper conceptualization, it leads to several problems later on. No? Magsugod na mo sa inyong research. If it's not properly conceptualized, problems will start to arise. No? Maka-realize the mo later on na there is a problem with the tools that are being used to measure the specific variables that we want for the study. We don't have respondents because we just wanted to have this initially, but in the actual setting, wala di ay na sila ni-exist. Now, the plans that we want within the methodology, we wanted a highfalutin plan, but in the real world setting, it's not achievable. So, having proper conceptualization, right, is important when we are doing and laying out the foundations of our research study. Now, let's talk about problem identification because a research project is always anchored in a problem, a real world problem. Without having a clear cut identification of what are the problems, again, it leads to several problems for your research, no? Without having to understand what problem are we really trying to address in this research. So the first thing that we have to understand when developing and conceptualizing researches is to ask ourselves, no? What is really the problem that we want to address? When generating ideas for research, as what I've said, it's always based on a research problem. So we have to find the area of focus. With the area of focus, we identify existing gaps in the literature, reflect on our observations because we are human beings. At the same time, practicing nurses, student nurses, we see real-world problems in the clinical setting and review several articles. I would always urge, or those who want to do research, know that we always start with existing literatures from published researches, existing statistics from different organizations, and we look back at our experience within the local setting. If these literatures are really present within the actual setting that we are working with, no? After we have understood initially that there is an existing problem within the literature, no? There are problems being observed in the actual setting. We reflect and review if these articles really make sense so that it can be, the primary focus of us doing a research problem. Now, conduct a comprehensive review. Determine what is already known and more importantly, what is unknown. No? Especially when students try to develop a qualitative research. For qualitative researches, it's not automatic na ay kay ganahan ko mag-qualitative research. We want to do a qualitative research. No, that's not the case. It's not on that perspective that it's based on the convenience of the researcher. For qualitative researches, just an example, no? We do a qualitative research when a phenomena, for example, is unknown. For quantitative researches, of course, we have to examine the different findings that are present in literatures and try to see what unknown is there that still needs further research so that we can do it as a research on our own. These are examples of gaps, no, that can be identified for this what we call unknown. Number one, what is the gap within the population? No? Is a certain group of individuals not yet studied, or has the existing literatures studied this particular population group and the other population groups have not yet been studied? Is there a problem in the analysis that was made? For example, the analysis was just limited to a certain number of individuals that cannot generalize, the entire population of focus. Is there a problem on the implication and methods? Now, for example, the study just used a descriptive approach when conducting a research. Of course, the objective of that particular method design and its implication is purely descriptive. It will just tell us the rates, the number of individuals having this particular condition, and it will not tell us the interconnectedness, no, the relationships that are present and what are the problems within that particular relationships. That's why when you are looking for literatures and you have identified, for example, now this is a common mistake among researchers who do research. They have identified several articles that talks about correlation. No? The study is always correlation. So the next thing that will tell us, no, because that is a gap within the method, is to move forward with the types of method that should be used if ever the researcher wants to do a research of the same context with the literatures, no? Because it's redundant if we continue the same design, no? Aturang usbo ng ginagmay nga mga things within it. Literature will tell us, especially if there are abundant literatures about a correlation study, is to move forward within that design or identify other gaps if we really want to focus purely on correlation. Next, gap on the concepts. The poor understanding of concepts can be a gap. No, if a concept is not purely understood, the perspectives, the theory, the methodology, the controversies, no, within the findings that were made, the conflicts and the contraindications, especially if there are a lot of findings that are present and the findings are contradicting to each other. We have to establish a clear-cut understanding on the findings that are contradictory to each other. We use different databases when looking for literatures. The first thing that we have to do when we are looking at databases is to identify what are the credible databases that we can use, no, for our study. The hallmark database that are used in the medical field are Scopus and ISI indexed databases and journals. So examples of that are the ones that are posted in the presentation, like PubMed. You can find an array of literatures that are credible and of quality because it is Scopus indexed. Next is the database of Scopus and Web of Science. Those are just examples of literatures and databases that we can use. No, napay daghan. But at the same time, when we are looking at different databases outside of the three, we should establish the credibility of these databases and journals. No, okay, there are a lot of predatory journals that cannot be trusted. The findings are just posted there without rigorous review, and that's something that is not good for the researches that we are making. Next, we also have subject-specific databases, no, like Embase. Embase is a database for biomedical and pharmacological fields of practice. The Cochrane Library for Systematic Reviews, one of the highest, no, in the pyramid of evidence is systematic reviews. So if you want to use systematic reviews in your literature, you can use Cochrane. And for education, this is just an example to give you a perspective that there are other literatures and databases that are outside of the medical field that can also be used in the medical field, no? Like the JSTOR, that's a database for education. Next, after we have identified the problems in the literature, in the observations that we can see in the real world setting, the next thing that a researcher must do is to develop a good research question. No? After the problem, next is the research question. That helps in the foundation and sets the direction of our research, having a good research question. In every research question, there are 4 elements. No? These are the important elements when we are developing a research question. This includes the P, I, C, and O, or your PICO elements of your research question. In some research designs, some of the elements may be present, all of the elements may be present, and some of the elements may not be present. So for P, that talks about the population of focus. For I, it talks about the intervention, or if it's a qualitative approach, it talks about the interest, no, or the phenomena of focus. You have to clearly identify what is the interest of the study. For C, it talks about the comparator, the control, and the context of why this particular research is being done. And for O, specifically for quantitative researches, it talks about outcomes. What are the outcomes being studied within this particular research? We have to establish that. Now, let's talk about the specific elements. We have here the letter P. Again, as what I've said, this talks about the population. This is the most important characteristic that tells us, no, who are the respondents that we intend to have in this particular study. It talks about the demographic factors of the population, like age, gender, and ethnicity of the population group that we want to have as participants in the study. The socio-economic factors like education, occupation, the economic status, like for example, people who live in lower and middle income countries, people who are recipients of the four-piece program. Those are examples of socioeconomic factors. And the setting. What particular setting do we want to study this particular population group? Are these community dwellers? Are these patients in the hospital? Are these subjects? No? Are these animal models who are considered subjects for an experimental study? Next, we have the intervention and comparator. When we are doing an experimental study, it always requires us to have an intervention and a comparator. The intervention is the active treatment that we do within the research. This is called the primary intervention of interest, which is received by the experimental group. On the other hand, we also have a comparator. A comparator can be a passive comparator like a placebo, no treatment, standard of care, or a waiting list of control. On the other hand, we can also have an active comparator. No? These are examples of variations of the intervention. For example, on the intervention group, they are receiving 100% of the treatment. But in the active comparator, we only have 50% of the active variation of the intervention. A drug, another drug, or a kind of therapy that is closely related with the intervention that we are using. These two elements are used, no, so that we can see if our intervention, no, in our research is really effective or more effective than the comparators that we are using. May it be a passive comparator or an active comparator. In descriptive studies, the intervention can be referred to as your independent variable. Later on the last element, we can identify what is the appropriate element to be used if it's the dependent variable. Here on the next part of the slide is the interest. It talks about the phenomena of interest if we are talking about qualitative research. You have to identify after the population as to what is the interest, no, the phenomena of interest that we want to focus on in this particular study. This talks about the defined events that we want to focus on as a phenomena, the activity, the experiences, or a certain process that we want to focus on a particular study. Um, in qualitative researches, the designs are responsive to the types of objectives that we want. For example, in phenomenology, the objective of that is to identify what phenomena is not understood. In grounded theory, as a design in qualitative research, it talks about elucidating an unknown process. And ethnography talks about understanding an unknown culture or patterns within the culture. So those are examples, no, of different objectives that answers what qualitative research design we want to use in a qualitative research. But again, interest in this perspective talks about when we are opting to have a qualitative research. Next is the context. Context is important when we want to study a specific population group. At the same time, context is important when we want to do a qualitative research. This talks about distinct characteristics, no, of the population or within the setting that we want to study. For example, malnourished children in low and middle income countries, malnourished children on high income countries. That's weird. Okay, how can malnourishment be present in high income countries? But we don't know. Those are examples of contexts that we can apply when developing a research question. Next are the outcomes. Outcomes are important when we are doing an experimental research because that sets the direction as to what are the interventions that we are trying to prove. And with this intervention, what are the outcomes that we expect to have? And this is also applicable for descriptive researches because outcomes, in this sense, talks about the dependent variable. Diba? We have mentioned in some of our discussions in research that the dependent variable receives the effect of the independent variable, particularly in correlation studies and predictive studies. Here is a cheat sheet. Butasan ako, ibutang ang akong now. But we will move the frame wherein my face is there as we move along. Here is a cheat sheet, and the important research elements that we have to suffice depending on the research approach and the research design that we intend to have for our researches. Now, the first there is a quantitative descriptive correlational. In a correlational research, we need to have the population, the intervention, which refers to the IV, and the outcome, which refers to the dependent variable. Those are the important elements that we need to address when we want to have a correlation study. A sample of a research question in this sense is, what is the relationship between the number of overtime hours worked by nurses and their self-reported levels of job burnout? In this case, the population are the nurses who are working overtime. The independent variable is the number of overtime hours, and the dependent variable is the self-reported levels of job burnout. For cross-sectional research design, we have the important research elements, which is the COCO-POP. It should have the context, the condition, or the particular disease or event that we want to study it. For example, individuals with PCOS, individuals with Alzheimer's, individuals with cancer, and the population of focus. This is an example of a COCO-POP research question. What is the prevalence of severe job burnout among nurses working in intensive care units in a specific metropolitan area in 2025? For an experimental research, of course, it should have the four research elements or the PICO elements. It should have the population, the intervention, the comparator, and the outcome. And that is our example. Don't worry, later on, we will have specific examples for us to examine. What are the elements present in the absence of the cheat sheet of the elements? Next is a quasi-experimental. A quasi-experimental is not a true experimental research because it lacks certain elements unlike the true experimental research. In a true experimental research, it should have randomization, manipulation, and control. In this case, for quasi-experimental studies, most of the time it lacks randomization. An FYI, siguro, no? When we are doing experimental researches, may it be a true experimental or a quasi-experimental, it's not automatic that we decide that we should do a quasi-experimental. We identify the appropriate design under experimental researches based on the existence of the literatures. For example, in the absence of literatures proving that something is effective or not, it automatically warrants the researchers that we should do a true experimental research. Because in a true experimental research, it clearly isolates if the particular intervention is effective or not. Dili siya ha, again, akong pisayaon. Dili siya automatic nga mag-quasi-experimental dayon ta kay tungod nga it's convenient on our end. We, for example, do a true experimental research in the absence of findings that talks about its particular effect, if it is effective or not. It doesn't end there because in true experimental researches, we don't move to quasi-experimental researches unless we have established the safety of this particular intervention. So, aside from efficacy, We should also establish through true experimental researches the safety levels of these particular interventions at variations, no, depending on the concentrations that we want our intervention to have. After we have established, no, the efficacy of this particular intervention, the different effects of this particular intervention, that's the time now, no, that it can warrant for us to do a quasi-experimental research. Because in quasi-experimental research, we are now trying to implement a particular effective intervention, a safe intervention in the real-world setting. So, unsa may pasabot ani sa atoa, whenever there is the absence of effectiveness literature, it automatically tells us to do a true experimental research. Once there are proven literatures that it is effective in the laboratory setting, we should apply that in the real world setting, because sometimes it is effective in a controlled environment like the laboratory, but because of real world differences, this findings from a true experimental study cannot be as effective as when it is applied in a laboratory. Now, that warrants us to do a quasi-experimental research. So, if we're trying to see if an intervention is still effective in the real world setting, that tells us to do a quasi-experimental approach. Kana ha? if there are if there is the absence of evidence, if an intervention is effective, it tells us to do a true experimental research. If there has been an established sets of findings on its effect, if it is effective or not, it tells us to do a quasi-experimental research to apply that in the real-world setting. Now, we move forward with quantitative, descriptive, predictive research design. For predictive researches, it only asks us to do a PIO element. Now, it tells us to suffice the PIO element, same as with your correlation study. This is an FYI for predictive researches. One of the most important things that we need to suffice in predictive researches are its assumption, particularly that there is an established relationship between the variables that we want to predict. Without that, we cannot predict things. And lastly, phenomenology. We have the PICO, the small o, or the population, the phenomena of interest, and the context of that particular phenomena. We should suffice this element before we do a qualitative approach, particularly phenomenology. I have listed all of these research designs and approaches because these are the most common research designs that are being used, by students when they are conceptualizing researches. So you can use and refer to this cheat sheet, when you are conceptualizing with your research mentors. Let's have an activity. For this activity, we will try to identify what are the elements that are present within this research question, and let's try to see, what particular research design warrants this particular research question. So our first activity has this research question: are non-pharmacological interventions compared with controlled interventions like usual care effective for treating depressive symptoms of older adults with depressive disorders? Sige, I'll give you 2 minutes for you to examine this research question, and we will try to see, kung unsa ni siya nga research question and what research design warrants this research question. 2 minutes. Sige, kataas naman ng 2 minutes. Let's move to the answers. I hope you try to dissect the different parts of this research question so that you can examine, as to what research design warrants this particular question. So this is the answer. From the given research question, we have the intervention, which is the one highlighted in green, the non-pharmacologic interventions. Our comparator in this research question are controlled interventions, the one highlighted in blue. Our population of interest here are the older adults with depressive symptoms, and the outcome is treating the depressive symptoms. If the depressive symptoms will be relieved or it will remain, or unsa may saktong term for that particular outcome, unsay pag-measure. So, what do you think warrants this particular research question? Having identified that it has the population, the intervention, the comparator, and the outcome? What do you think? Yes, of course, that is a true experimental research. Next, we have another research question here. What is the experience of recovering from burns injuries in adults over 18 years old of age patients, no, during their stay in a hospital burns care unit? It gives you already the idea, no? It asks about the experience. Unsa kuno ang experience na gusto aning mga respondents. So if it is an experience, it is a qualitative research. The important elements here is your PICO with a small o. The population, the phenomena of interest, and the context. The population here are those burn injury patients. The phenomena of interest is their experience of recovering from burns, and the context is within the hospital burns care unit. Sige. So now, based on the cheat sheet that we have presented, I want every one of you not to identify a research question based on the readings that you have, or maybe from the experiences that you were able to observe in the clinical setting, and let's try to practice, no, developing a research question, because again, having a solid research question helps in setting the foundation of our research. Okay. So as we move forward, since this is a pre-recording, I hope you will be making your research questions on your end so that once you meet your research mentors, you can present to them some of the research question that has literatures, no, that you have read on your end. Kaya para i-meet po ninyo sa inyong research mentor, mamuta naman na inyong research mentor na, oh, unsa may rason ng anong you have made this particular research question. You should tell your research mentor na, oh, ma'am, I was able to make this particular research question because I was able to read, no, literatures and statistics that mauna ang mga problema karon sa kalibutan. You always have to defend that way, no, so that you are factual and you are objective when you are presenting these kinds of things to your research mentor. Sige. Now that we're done in developing the research question, we establish a framework through the variables of study that we want to focus on in our researches. So it is important that we have to align the direction of our research to our research agenda. Our research agenda for the college is community development. So we have to remember when we are doing and developing researches that the direction that this research findings should always go back to community development. It should always serve, no, the population and the community that we are catering in nursing. Consider the research approach and design. Follow a certain framework. In our case, for the university, we have the IPO model, the input, the process, and the output. And understand the nature of variables and tools to measure the variable, no, that you want to study in your research. Okay. To guide you further in establishing what are the appropriate research designs and approaches that can help yield strong findings and impactful findings, this is the evidence hierarchy according to Pollitt and Beck. Under the lowest level of the hierarchy of evidence is level 8, which is the non-research source. We give premium, no, to the inputs, the expert opinions that our experts in the clinical field can provide. But that is not the sole basis of everything because it belongs to the lowest level of evidence. Above that, on level 7, are quantitative studies, particularly descriptive studies like surveys. It talks about the frequency and distribution of everything. Above level 7 is level 6, systematic reviews or metasynthesis of qualitative studies. Above level 6 is level 5, non-experimental observational studies. These are the most common research designs that students and researchers do at level 5. Observational, like correlational studies, predictive studies. So if we have a high concentration of this particular designs, it tells us that we have to move forward. After level 5 is level 4, systematic reviews of non-experimental observational studies. At level 3 are non-randomized trials like quasi-experimental. At level 2 are randomized controlled trials. or true experimental researches, and highest yielding evidence is your systematic review or meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. So moving forward, aside from identifying the appropriate designs based on this hierarchy also guides us when we are looking at literatures, doing literature review for our studies to identify the highest level, no, to support the claims that we have in our literatures. So for you students, when we will be examining your manuscripts, we should expect to see findings from the highest levels of evidence and not just purely opinion from different individuals in the clinical setting, or worse, your opinion as the researcher. It should always be backed up with the highest level of evidence so that we remain factual, no, on the write-ups that we make for our manuscript. So you can refer to this recording, this discussion and presentation, or you can look at Pollitt and Beck, no, for this evidence hierarchy that I referred to. Tapos ang i-move, no, ang ato ang kuan kay di na sa tamaklaro. After we have identified the research problem, after we have developed our research question, our next task is to write the introduction. No? Pinakakapoy o pinakalisod, because sometimes it's difficult to move forward without writing everything in the introduction. But this is a guide for you when you are developing your introduction. As you can see, I have depicted here an inverted triangle. So meaning, magsugod ang atong introduction sa kaning parts kung asa baga ang triangle, which tells us that when we write the first parts of the introduction or the rationale, it should have a big bulk of the research problem that is present in the clinical setting, that is present in the literatures that we really want to address. After contextualizing the problem, you support the problem with existing literatures and solutions that can help address this problem, because this solution will lead to the discussion as to why you are focusing on this particular variables. After the solutions, identify the best solution, identify the limitation or gaps of knowledge that is present, identify the research question that you intend to address in this research, and discuss the aim of the study and the methodological approach that you want to employ for this research. So this is an example, no, of an introduction that talks about the different parts that we have referred to when we are writing the introduction. Now, since in this era, no, a lot of you students, with caution, no, I am helping you because a lot now are using artificial intelligence. You can visit, for example, Notebook LM. This is an AI platform. I'm not saying you use artificial intelligence purely. No, I'm just presenting this to you so that you can have a smart use of artificial intelligence when you are conceptualizing your researches. After you have identified the problem from the literatures, you develop your research question. Once you have developed a solid research question, you type the research question on the Discover pane, no, of Notebook LM. Notebook LM, after you have pasted the research question, will generate several literatures that talks about this research question. That's the advantage of using Notebook LM, because the responses later on of Notebook LM on your research question will always be dependent on the corresponding literature that it has generated based on the research question that you have identified. So it's not delusional in nature like just using ChatGPT. We are using artificial intelligence smartly and effectively in this case. That's why it is important that before you use this particular platform, you have to identify what is the problem. You have to identify what research question you want to answer in your research, so that Notebook LM can help you identify the appropriate literatures, no, that are relevant and related to the research question. And by then, you can use Notebook LM now to identify concepts and discussions that you want to have, no, in your study. I think that is the end of our conceptualization starter pack. I hope that it has helped you have an idea. It jump-started everything when you will be conceptualizing with your research mentors and with your group. Thank you and have a great day.